Hey YouTube, Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Got a great episode expanding out our coverage of the TikTok hearings to focus on the bigger question of US-China tech competition in the middle of the global realignment that we're seeing across the international system. I'm having return guest Jacob Helberg on to speak about the topic. His previous episode was about his book, The Wires of War. Now he's a commissioner on the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. So it's cool to see an author transition from that ideas space to that implementation and serious public policy space. So we're going to get an update on all that and these broader topics. Hope you all enjoy this conversation and definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. Jacob Helberg, welcome back to the Realignment.
Marshall, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you. Something that's happened as the catalog of the show has just gotten deeper and deeper and deeper. We're at episode, I think this is 359. I have guests like yourself who are just going to and continue to advance new different things. We had you on in 2020 to discuss some of your writing at foreign policy. We then had you on in 2021 to discuss the wires of war. And now we're obviously speaking with you about the TikTok hearings. But the big development on your end, I think, would be the fact that you are now a member of the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. DC specializes in impressive sounding yet completely intangible organizations and commissions. So could you explain what this role means, like what the commission actually is, and like how you kind of look at it through the work that you do?
Sure. So the commission was created in the early 2000s when China adhered to the WTO, and a number of members of Congress had reservations about whether China would uphold its WTO commitments. So they created this commission to supervise, monitor, and report to Congress China's different activities and issues relevant to the US-China relationship on an ongoing yearly basis. The job of the commission is ultimately to advise Congress on laws related to the US-China relationship in all areas. So that includes technology, economics and trade, military, and so forth. And so I joined as a commissioner. A number of members of Congress felt strongly about the need for the commission to have someone with a technology background on the commission, given everything going on in the world today and in the US-China technological competition domain space. And it's been an incredibly exciting time to be part of this increasingly influential body to advise legislators on important issues at a time when they're debating historic legislation to move the needle in the technological competition arena.
Yeah, and I want this episode to be forward-looking. You and I both know we all have our cliched at this point talking points about how in 2000 we thought China would do this with the WTO. It didn't do that, so here we are today. But given the fact that that story, especially regarding the origins of the commission that you just articulated, is so centered on trade, right? So in real life, goods, manufacturing jobs, et cetera, your work is really having to do with the technological, the digital aspect of that. Can you talk about how you feel about, I don't want to say the contradictory nature of those two areas? So like the in-person, the real, and the digital, how are they different? How are you seeing members of Congress be able to think about, okay, so we're changing our trade policy, but maybe that has nothing to do with our digital goods policies. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think actually there is a lot of continuity between digital and analog. I mean, the commission report has obviously been charged with reporting to Congress every year whether China has been upholding its WTO commitments. And every single year, the conclusions of the report to Congress was overwhelmingly that China is not upholding its WTO commitments for the last 22 or so years. And interestingly, in the digital sphere, you're actually seeing, so, the conclusion in the analog world is China isn't playing by the rules. And in the digital world, the top level feedback is that China isn't playing by the rules. They're hacking our systems, they're stealing our intellectual property, they're instrumentalizing and co-opting their technology companies to cultivate them as tools of foreign espionage and surveillance in other countries, including in the United States, unfortunately. And so in a lot of ways, Congress right now is in the middle of a much needed holistic rethink of what the appropriate economic relationship should be with China moving forward in both trade, and you're seeing that with the debate on outbound capital flows, but also in the digital technology world, and you're seeing that with the debate with, initially started with Huawei and ZTE. Now we're having a debate with TikTok, which doesn't impact just TikTok, but as you know, 4 out of the top 10 most downloaded apps in the US are Chinese companies. So how we deal with TikTok is actually going to have a cascade of waterfall effects on other potential applications in the US. And so it's really a comprehensive rethink of what the right relationship should be moving forward. And ultimately, the main through line of that rethink is that we need to decouple for security, for both security reasons as well as economic competitiveness reasons.
Yeah, I'd love for you to speak from the Valley side of your background and your work and your personality. When you're talking about how there are 4 out of 10 most downloaded apps coming from Chinese companies, obviously, what does that have to say about how American tech companies were maybe like off their game in the like mid to late 2010s? Because something that I am obviously like, I'm very much with you on the TikTok decoupling policy, but I'm sympathetic when just everyday listeners and people engaged in the debate say like, look, a lot of this seems like cope. It seems like Silicon Valley is ticked off that they missed short form video and all these totally non-political aspects of technological development in social media and apps. So now what they're trying to do is kind of just jump back ahead by getting government involved. Like, how do you think about the argument that Silicon Valley just was left in the dust just by not actually keeping up with innovation?
I think you can have two arguments that can live in parallel that can both be true. I mean, it is true that TikTok is a very innovative, highly addictive product. It's also true that it's a product that unfortunately has emanated from a company that's completely under the influence and control of the Chinese Communist Party. And both of those things can be true at the same time. So, and actually, I would argue that it's even more concerning that you're seeing the Chinese Communist Party being so innovative and effective at getting so many users in the US. With that being said, I think, you're touching upon a topic that I think is really important, which is that the argument for restricting TikTok, the most salient part of that argument is the data security, national security argument. But there's actually many facets to that argument. And there's also the trade reciprocity aspect to the argument. I mean, let's remember that China has banned nearly every single major American content platform in China, including LinkedIn, Facebook, Google, YouTube, GitHub, the list goes on and on. And so, there is a legitimate case to be made, and many people have been making it, that if you are going to believe in basic rules of trade reciprocity, why should we allow TikTok and Chinese content platforms in the US when they don't allow a single one of them in China? And it's really the pinnacle of irony when you have Chinese officials using Twitter, an American platform that they banned in China, to try to make the case against banning TikTok in the US. So, there's the trade reciprocity argument, there's the data security argument, and ultimately, there are real questions about TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, having also been complicit in providing the Chinese government with information about Uyghur women of childbearing age to support, genocidal practices against Uyghurs. So there's a strong human rights component to this too.
Given what you just said, I was very interested in a article the Wall Street Journal put out about you and the broader Hill in the Valley work you're doing. It quoted a TikTok representative explicitly stating the Chinese government has never asked to share US user data, nor would we if asked. I'll put aside the first part of the statement, but the second part was very interesting to me because the claim, they have now laid down the point that their claim is they would not follow orders, quote unquote, even under the national security law that exists in China in terms of like civil, government fusion. How do you think about that statement? I'm sure you read the piece, obviously. Like, what was your reaction to them saying very clearly, like we would say no if something nefarious was asked of us?
What they are saying is that they would break the law in China, and ultimately that is not a promise that we should be relying on. And the reason that TikTok failed so miserably to reassure concerns in the US is because no matter what they say, the law is written in black and white in China, and it directly conflicts with American laws, which have a basic expectation of personal privacy and intellectual property protection. We have a constitutional amendment, the Fourth Amendment in our Constitution, provides Americans with reasonable expectations of privacy against unreasonable searches and seizures. China's national intelligence law is an affront to that basic principle of privacy. And so ultimately, if TikTok comes here in the US and says that they're going to protect our privacies, that means that they're going to be breaking the laws in China. And if they go by the laws in China, that means that they're going to be breaking the law in the US. And so, if they're not breaking the letter of the law, they're certainly breaking the spirit of law. And so ultimately, Congress had a choice in approaching the hearings between being performative and being substantive. And I'm incredibly encouraged and pleased to see that they really went down the substantive route and they raised hard questions. They asked the CEO if he believes that genocide against Uyghurs are taking place, which sounds like it's unrelated, but it's really to test, the key question is TikTok an independent company from the CCP? And so pressing him on questions like that actually challenges him to, and gives him the megaphone to test, is he capable of expressing a viewpoint like that? And the answer was no. He refused to say that the Chinese government is engaging in human rights atrocities against Uyghurs, which in itself shows that he is following the law in China. And despite being, in a US congressional testimony on American soil. And so, I think the outcome of the hearings substantially increased the likelihood of a full ban on TikTok in the United States.
Here's something I'm wondering. I'm thinking about this from a political communications perspective. I wonder, the more I've learned about the famous Grindr Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States case. So basically, back in 2019, a Chinese company had acquired a majority stake in Grindr, which is a gay dating app, and due to privacy concerns, CFIUS forced them to disinvest/sell the company. I'm wondering if maybe at a strategic level it would have been better for opponents of TikTok just to say, "Hey, let's just do the Grindr approach." We could have this whole debate about like screen addiction and teen girls, but that affects every single app. And there's been a lot of good reporting about how basically every app is becoming the same anyways. So that issue would exist whether or not this was about Instagram or whether Vine came back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's push that out to the side. At a bare minimum, this seems very much akin to CFIUS with Grindr. So sell it. And then if you refuse to sell it, which would be weird because it's a basic thing we've been through in a bunch of different contexts. The Obama administration forced a Chinese company to sell a wind farm in 2012 because it was located too close to a U.S. military base in the Pacific Northwest. I guess this is kind of what I'm getting. What's your reaction to that? I feel like it would have been easier to say, this is just like Grindr, just with way more users, sell it. And then if you won't do it, we'll then talk about a ban. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is that it's apples to oranges, and it's actually quite different.
Okay.
The reason is that Grindr started out as an American company. The engineers, were always in the U.S. The servers were in the U.S. And then it just so happened that a group of Chinese investors stepped in and bought the company, which did trigger a lot of legitimate data security questions. And I'm glad that CFIUS stepped in and addressed that. In the case of TikTok, it's different because TikTok has an enormous engineering footprint in China. It has servers in China, which even though it claims that it doesn't use those servers to store American data, it also failed to guarantee that some American data can't be accessed by its engineers in China, which can really be, a loophole that you can drive a truck through. So at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, is ownership going to address data transfers, the risk of data transfers? And the answer, in the case of TikTok, the answer is no, because as long as you have such a large engineering presence in China, you have to address that. And so the only way to address that is to shut down all of their operations. The other thing that I'd like to note is, even if you do that, even if you address corporate ownership, do a divestment, you shut down the engineering offices in China, you shut down all the servers in China. TikTok is a company that has been, since the Trump White House, has effectively been preparing for the eventual potential day where another divestment debate might reemerge since the Trump administration. And so if you are the Chinese government and you effectively are able to leverage influence over this company, it wouldn't be far-fetched to assume that the app at this point has so many back doors into it that are buried under millions of lines of code that if your concern is legitimately to secure American user data, then it's almost impossible to actually accomplish that goal at this point with TikTok. And so ultimately, I believe that a divestment wouldn't really address the root of the national security issue. The last point that I would add is, according to Chinese export laws, TikTok and ByteDance would actually have to get approval from the Chinese government in order to go through with a sale to an American buyer. And the Chinese government has actually already signaled its opposition to approve such a sale, based on the basic premise that the TikTok algorithms contain sensitive artificial intelligence that could potentially be salient to China's national security. So if the Chinese government opposes the sale of TikTok to an American buyer, the only option that the US government has left is actually a full ban on TikTok. And so that's why, to me, it seems like if you're really concerned about addressing, and if you're serious about addressing the national security risk, it's all roads eventually lead to a ban in the case of TikTok.
No, thank you. That's a very, very, very helpful framework for thinking about this. And from the perspective of the Chinese government, aside from just the proprietary algorithm and AI concerns, at a baseline level, it seems like it would be a huge soft power loss for that sale to go through. It would basically be the implicit admission but all the concerns you just articulated would be valid. And that would play into other companies, that play into other technology. That would obviously affect the other 3 apps that you talked about in that top 10. So it's hard to imagine a world where, from any just basic empathy level, you and the Chinese, like you at this point in the debate, put aside all the espionage concerns. It would not make any sense for the Chinese government to okay a disinvestiture or sale, given that. So yeah, that's and I guess this kind of goes to the point of a debate around, CFIUS is different if it's 2019 or 2020 versus it being 2023. That brings me to my next question, which is, obviously the Wires of War came out in 2021. It's been 2 years. Obviously, it's a broader book about your experience in Silicon Valley. But could you really just kind of, if you were to do an afterword on the afterword on the afterword, I know we're past like the paperback coming out, but like, what would you say has changed in the past 2 years to the point of what you said about TikTok disinvestiture starting in 2020?
So, it's interesting because in a lot of ways, it's really been mind-blowing just how many parts of the analysis in the Wires of War have come to pass in the last, 2 or so years. One of my biggest messages was that the US and China are in the throes of what I called a gray war, which you can easily, characterize as a Cold War, and that the best way to confront it is to be honest about that. And if you're going to be honest about it, you can reestablish meaningful deterrence in order to keep the peace. One of my big concerns today is we haven't been intellectually honest about this. The national security community still overwhelmingly clings to this idea that we're in this, gentleman-like competition with China. And that ultimately is a true disservice to peace, because if you're in a competition, you can afford to go slow, you can afford to lose, you can afford to take incremental marginal steps. And ultimately, if the US loses ground, which, unfortunately, it's been making progress on a number of fronts, but we have been losing ground in a number of other areas, that erodes American deterrence. And if you erode American deterrence, you increase the likelihood of conflict. And just in the last month, Xi Jinping has delivered 4 speeches telling his military to prepare for war. He's de-dollarizing his economy to try to sanction-proof himself against potential American sanctions, which also raises the prospect of, is he planning a potential attempted invasion or blockade around Taiwan? So all the signs coming out of China are extremely concerning. They're all pointing to an increasing likelihood of an act of aggression from China against Taiwan and potentially by extension the US. And ultimately, I think that's probably the biggest change. Is the question today isn't whether or not we're in a Cold War or a gray war, but whether that Cold War will turn hot in the next 2 to 3 years. And I think the slower we are, if you think about the interwar period, in the late 30s, the only story that mattered in the late 30s was, would Western democracies going to successfully deter Germany from waging, a continent-wide assault on the rest of Europe and eventually the world? And ultimately, the answer to that is that Britain, France, and the other, allied powers failed to deter Germany. And that fundamentally rocked world history, to its core. And I really worry that we're at a similar inflection point where today we're seeing the military buildup in China. We're seeing this autocratic authoritarian leader telling his military to prepare for war. We're seeing him, sending ships in the South China Sea. I worry that the only story that matters today and that is still underappreciated is, what are we doing to stop this, high-speed motion train that is barreling towards war? And what are we doing to ultimately slow the train in its tracks and prevent a war from taking place? And I am very concerned that the steps being taken are still way too incremental.
I guess when you raise the interwar period, a bunch of questions come to mind. So like number one, I'm curious, and not to push the metaphor too far, but obviously if you are going to tell the story of how the interwar period was a disaster, you would focus on the fact that the French put all of their attention into building the Maginot Line, right? So the Maginot Line, for listeners who aren't World War II buffs, is this long, incredibly advanced for the time, defensive series of emplacements over miles and miles and miles. In many ways, it's designed to repel a World War I style invasion. Obviously, what you then have happen is the Germans go through the Ardennes, they invent blitzkrieg, and it becomes entirely irrelevant. Is there an equivalent, if we're sticking with the interwar period metaphor, of a Maginot Line, which the West has invested a lot of faith, energy, or even cope to make it more colloquial in, that you see, or maybe there isn't an equivalent?
I think we still spend, so much of winning conflicts are about leaning into your comparative advantages. And when you think about what are America's comparative advantages over China, it's really in the space of artificial intelligence, software, some of these emerging technologies. And the amount of investment that we're making in our comparative advantages are so de minimis relative to the overall budget of the Department of Defense. I really worry that we still significantly underinvest in emerging technologies that could potentially be decisive in the outcome of a potential conflict with China.
And something I'm also curious about, speaking of investment, that's another good pivot to the Valley side of things. There's been talk that Silicon Valley investment firms are investing, not only investing in China, which is a whole broader debate around decoupling, but are actually investing in funds that have to do with AI. So once again, that's one of our competitive advantage areas. To what degree do you have thoughts on the ability of US-based investors to pour money into geostrategically significant technology spaces like that?
I think it's shameful, and I think it should be illegal. I supported In the Wires of War, and as a commissioner on this commission, and as a private citizen and scholar advocating for various legislative projects, I've been incredibly supportive of a new framework on outbound capital flows toward China. I think it's completely inappropriate that the U.S. be funding both sides of the tech race. American technology venture capital firms have no business investing in Chinese technology companies that are both ultimately make a farce out of the concept of private property when you think about shareholders, and on the other hand are also building the capabilities of America's number one geopolitical adversary. So I think it should be illegal. I think a number of funds who have accrued significant China-related, offshoots and subsidiaries should probably be broken up. And ultimately, I think it is the job of the U.S. government to lay down the rules of the road for what's okay and what's not okay from a national security standpoint. It's actually quite literally spelled out in the preamble of our Constitution. So, so I'm hopeful that Congress is going to move forward and establish a law on that. But I think it's, time is of the essence, and I think these companies really should be careful because what their activities in China could backfire in ways that they don't always anticipate.
I'd like you to do the thing you're so good at, which is translating between the two coasts. I'm in Texas, obviously, so the coastal metaphor has to be put aside for a second. But I understand. I just read Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, and I totally understand Phil Knight wanting to get into the Chinese market to make Air Jordans, right? That just makes total sense. There's no, even put aside like, wages and like deindustrialization and all that stuff. Just at a baseline level, you want to make shoes, you make shoes as cheap as possible. He was already in Japan. He wanted to go to Taiwan. He goes to China, blah, 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 blah. I genuinely do not understand why a VC in today's environment would be at all morally comfortable investing in AI related funds in China. I'm sure you've spoken with people who are in that, so you don't have to name names, but like, can you just help me understand from and I think it's easy just to say that everyone's just sort of greedy, but that feels like a little simple. What is going on there?
It's hard for me to totally put my finger on it because it seems so disconnected from reality that it really is hard to explain. But the feedback I've heard from a number of fund managers that are still very attached to the idea of doing business in China is this basic impulse and false perception that when you invest money in China, your returns on paper are actually still quite high. And so for all of the noise around, regulatory crackdowns and so forth, you can still generate high returns for your LPs through funds in China. I believe that that is a completely misguided pricing of the risk of investing in China. I think fund managers investing in China are completely misevaluating the underlying risk and mischaracterizing that risk to their LPs. China is a system that fundamentally does not believe in private property. It's also a government that is on a fast track to a potential geopolitical conflict with the US. And China's foreign investment law that it passed in 2018 explicitly says that the Chinese government has a right to expropriate and nationalize any foreign investment in China. So all these billions of dollars that these LPs have given fund managers that are now shipping money to China could potentially be gone overnight. So, your real risk adjusted return isn't just potentially, are you making 10% annualized gains or 20% annualized gains? It's could you potentially lose the entirety of your principal? So I think it's totally shameful. It's a terrible business decision. And I really believe that it's going to end up backfiring on quite a few funds that are at risk of potentially committing breaches of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but are also at risk of losing the entire principal of their investments.
You explain why they're at risk of breaching the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act?
Well, simply, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a basic prohibition on American citizens and entities and business people to engage in acts of bribery with foreign nationals and foreign governments in order to benefit the commercial interests of their business. And the simple reality is everyone knows that it's impossible to get ahead in China without bribery. So when a fund hires the relatives of political Chinese Communist Party officials, when they, have meetings with officials, and out of those meetings, big investment deals are announced about, investing in things strategic to the Chinese Communist Party to curry favor with them. They're really flirting with actions that leave paper trails that could potentially end up in criminal liability against the CEOs of these companies for violations of the FCPA. And so, again, my warning to a lot of these business leaders is now that the public and lawmakers are starting to shed a light on all these activities and are starting to scrutinize these activities more, my warning to business officials on the West Coast is be very careful with how you tread the line in China, because things could go terribly wrong for you if you're not careful.
Yeah, and I want to go to the other coast again here and just ask you about the Biden administration. So there's a couple different routes that the TikTok ban conversation is happening. You obviously have a lot of the legislation. I'll ask you about that in a second. But the Biden administration's been fairly hawkish on this question for a Democratic administration. Like, how do you, and obviously it's important to separate like rhetoric from action, but like, how would you assess rhetoric and action from the Biden administration on these issues?
I would assess it to be a mixed picture. And, I think on the whole, it's decent. But so let's look at some of the things that they've done. They've been actually incredibly astute at getting our allies to close ranks on a number of different fronts. Collaborate in the world of technology, conversations that they've had and engagements that they've had with allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia have really been incredibly substantive and pretty paradigm shifting in a lot of ways to help offset, create technology alliances, create, conversations around the production of semiconductors with South Korea and Samsung. So, great ground covered on those fronts. Unfortunately, with respect to, a lot of other areas, frankly, the results have been lacking. I mean, I think we knew that TikTok was a national security threat 2 years ago. Biden issued an EO basically saying that he was going to take 6 months to do a review of the security profile of the app, and nothing's come out of it. And I know that now, finally, 2 years after, as we're starting a new presidential race, Congress is taking on this issue. The administration has had 2 years to make a decision on this. And again, the reason why I think it matters is that it's really not just about TikTok, but it's about Chinese technologies in the US. Our country is filled with Chinese technologies that all have back doors across this country. We have LiDARs, Chinese-made LiDARs by a company called Hesai across this country. We have
What's a LiDAR? Sorry.
15 million. LiDARs are basically computer vision for machines. It's sensors that allow machines to perceive the physical world around us. And we have 15 million units of a Chinese vacuum cleaner brand called Roborock that basically scans the floor plans of American households and saves that data in servers in China. 15 million units were sold in the United States last year. So unfortunately, there is a lot of work that still needs to be done with restricting the sale of Chinese technologies in the US. And I'm a little bit concerned that the administration has been very slow and too piecemeal in its approach to this.
So as we're nearing this last section, I just want to offer a comment and get your reaction to. I think the hearings went pretty well. I am a little frustrated that the data privacy, once again, the teen girl social media addiction bit got mixed in with the foreign ownership question, because the way I think you're articulating it's quite well is just at the end of the day, this is telecommunications technology. The stakes are very high. That's all that matters. Like, you could install all of the 60-minute screen limits you want. You could perfectly solve for addiction, this change the color of the app, and there would still be an underlying issue. So I would love for you to kind of just offer listeners a key takeaway when it comes to just the reality of technological decoupling, separate from just like treating this like another social media app. Like Rand Paul had his statement talking about like the dancing app, which is just like frustrating to me because it doesn't matter what's actually on the app. What matters is the decoupling side. So can you just offer just like a straightforward, concise articulation of the decoupling? I'll do a different episode on the social media addiction issue, but I just really think it's important that we bracket off that even if this were the perfect app ever, it wouldn't change any of these underlying issues.
Right. And you're right. The content moderation piece is it's legitimate. We used to have laws in this country that prevented a foreign government from owning media companies for, grounds of national security. This isn't that different. I mean, should the Chinese government own arguably what's one of the largest media companies in the US? Probably not. There's a lot of content moderation questions about them manipulating the algorithm to push Chinese propaganda. But that's a totally different issue from the data security angle to this, which is that the app, whether it's Shen, or Temu, or a seemingly innocuous, benign clothing platform, or whether it's a social media app, the app is a piece of software on your phone that gives the Chinese government a backdoor into your deepest, darkest, most intimate secrets for political use, and that is ultimately a violation of the spirit of our Fourth Amendment privacy protections in this country. The U.S. government doesn't have the ability to engage in spying on its own citizens in that way, and nor should the Chinese government.
And I think the big question I have, this is the other part of the debate that I think opponents of TikTok action I think they were pretty successful at doing this kind of sleight of hand of focusing the debate on, well, let's talk about everyone's data privacy violations. Let's talk about Meta. Let's talk about Google. Let's talk about
it's such a false
Twitter,
equivalency.
all of those. So I think the question basically is, so here's the obvious point is we just bracket that to the side. We say like, that's a whole, and look, we got a conversation. That's a whole other hearing due to the domestic. You can't listen to the previous 35 minutes and think that Mark Zuckerberg is in the same category. The debate we're having about Mark Zuckerberg is just not in the same category.
It's not
at just the baseline level. But that said, I do think it's important that critics of the status quo have maybe their own framework for how we should all think about digital technology and privacy broadly. So still bracketed, but still have one. Like, how would you just think about? I mean, you have a kid, so
sure.
You're thinking of this too.
To be clear, Facebook has actually been advocating for a federal privacy law. So California has a state level, the California Data and Privacy Law is already in effect in California, which is effectively the de facto law of the land because most content platforms are based out of California, Netflix, Facebook, YouTube, and so forth. And so instead, they're not going to create a version of their platform for California and a version of their platform for every other state. So we already effectively have a privacy law, which is the California privacy law, which is effectively the law applied in all 50 states. So that's why content platforms have actually been saying, hey, federal government, why don't you just make the California privacy law the law of the land? That way we have the same law everywhere. There is a federal preemption in the law that prevents a patchwork of 50 different laws across the US, which I think would be a fine approach. But I think you're right that ultimately there is the data security law, the data privacy law that should be applied to all technology companies, including American ones. But then there is the very specific, concerns about national security that really apply with foreign controlled and foreign influenced companies, especially companies that are controlled and influenced by the Chinese Communist Party, which has unique sets of risks that don't apply to American companies. And trying to treat and conflate the two as the same is ultimately, I think, muddled thinking.
So here's the last big question. You laid out a mental framework in this episode, which is we should think of this moment as just like the interwar period. And I think if someone is a deep thinker about history, they'll hear that. And that's sort of like, whoa, like pause the episode. If it's 1937 right now, this at a baseline level, like that should be like worldview shattering. That said, if it's, 1937, that even the TikTok ban that you advocate doesn't at all address what you're really talking about. At the same time, too, like investing in our comparative advantage technologies, like that's great too. It was very important in the 1930s that, the United States was like taking in Jews fleeing Europe who would then go work on the Manhattan Project, which is how we ultimately like win the war. There were those like macro things that are happening, but I'd like you to just close this episode by discussing like what's the broad spectrum of things that you think that matter if we're going to adopt the mental framework of think of this as 1937.
The big picture is we need a new technology trade architecture for the current moment we find ourselves in. And the building blocks of that architecture is we need restrictions on imports of Chinese technologies in the US across the board, from Huawei in the hardware space to TikTok in the software space. We really need to take a hard look at restricting Chinese imports in the US. We need to restrict American investments in China. We need to tighten Chinese investments in the US. We need to shore up, friendshoring, what people call friendshoring. So meaning at the same time that we wind down technology trade with China, identifying opportunities to expand trading opportunities for our companies with like-minded friendly countries. And ultimately, we need to accelerate dramatically the revitalization of our production capacity. We won World War II in no small part because we were able to be the arsenal of democracy because we were the factory floor for the world. We're not in that position anymore. And that is hugely concerning. We can't let China outproduce us and on the battlefield and on the factory floor. And so ultimately, manufacturing is a vital component for how we win this current moment. And I think we can get there because through innovation, we can actually, revamp our manufacturing capacity in ways that people don't necessarily expect or give credit for in Washington, but it's going to take a lot of work.
So for the actual closing question, got some listener questions from folks who are working in state legislatures in the country. We've talked about DC, we've talked about Silicon Valley, but something that 30 states have done is they've individually passed bans on TikTok on state government devices. But what's interesting too is that oftentimes these bans will actually affect like other Chinese companies too, Alibaba, Tencent, et cetera. Could you just offer a like super zoomed in, like what is like a member of the Florida state, like how should they think of this issue? Because it's rarely, if ever, framed in like a state level issue because it's foreign policy. But like right now, given how diffuse and decentralized our policies are, and I think given the lack of, like you said, comprehensive, completely bipartisan, here's the approach we're taking the next 5 years, it leaves a lot of space for people to fill. What's your advice for people who are doing this at the state level and who are confronting these issues?
Yeah, I mean, my advice would be to show at the state level what the blueprint should be for the country. But to be clear, I think, the efforts being undertaken at the state level are commendable, but ultimately this really is a federal issue. And so, I'm a little bit concerned with Congress getting too comfortable punting this over to the states. I hate to repeat myself, but it is in the preamble of our Constitution that the federal government, that a fundamental purpose of the federal government is to provide for the common defense. And so this, to me, really falls in that category. And so it's ultimately Congress's responsibility to take the necessary steps to protect the entirety of all 50 states in this union. And so while the efforts undertaken at the state level are commendable and are worthy and worthwhile, ultimately the buck stops with Congress.
That is a great place to leave it. Jacob Helberg, thank you for joining me again on the Realignment.
Thanks for having me.